Thank you all, first of all, for coming today. My name is Olmo Maldonado. I'm a senior software engineer at Zapier. I have to admit a couple of things before getting started. First off, this is my first conference that I'm speaking at. Definitely not my first conference, but this one's definitely special. Everybody has been really kind and warm at welcoming me to this, so I appreciate that. Also with me are my family. They happen to be able to join me in this crusade. So my daughter Eva and my wife Esmeralda are here as well. So it's really great that I can share this with them. Right, so OpenAPI Driven Development. It's definitely not a term that I've coined. Within the company, it is something that I've been referring to quite often. I work at Zapier. Our mission is to make automation work for everyone. If you're not as familiar, we connect over 5,000 plus web apps altogether using very little code. In fact, in most cases, no code at all. And if you're like me, and I hope that some of you are as well, and you want to code, you're more than welcome to. We have a really robust platform and completely free. I've automated a lot of things away with the platform, one of which was writing a really simple, library registration bot that would go to our local library to register our homeschooled kid to have a room at 12 in the morning without actually being up at that time. Again, all completely free, very extensible, very powerful, and very reliable. We power a lot of our critical users, Zaps, that's what we call the workflows that they do. And this makes our job very interesting because as you can imagine, connecting all of those different APIs together can be a bit of a fun and pain at the same time. All right, but what is going on with Zapier? What are we at right now? So Zapier from the get-go is a monolithic stack, Django, Python. Now today we have over 20 teams, many zones, and each of those teams and zones are just making their own microservices. We're using different technology stacks, GraphQL among many of those. This makes working interoperability between teams more exciting, more interesting as well. So not only do we integrate with many apps out there, we're also integrating internally within our teams. And what we found is a couple of problems. And actually, a lot of the keynote talks this morning talked about what are the common problems that we're surfacing, especially that we know APIs often. We know that it's very common to say, wait a minute, the docs say this, but it does something else. What's going on there? The dreaded API drift. Of course, because we're highly motivated to have the right API habits, we often ran into a situation where we have architect astronauts looking at your code and deciding, looking at your design docs and deciding, have you tried this, have you tried that? And while their ideas and intentions are great, practically it doesn't sometimes make sense. So the last thing that we're noticing is the toil and the upkeep. I was attending one of the breakout sessions where they were talking about this. And it's security, it's everything else, but in general, we want to allow our engineers to be going on the high-speed highway, just moving really fast and delivering user value. So let me walk you through what I meant by that. Today, there's still a good amount of people at Zapier not using OpenAPI Driven Development. What's going to end up happening is you might get together on a call, you're going to make decisions on the call, you're going to write them in a document, and at some point, both teams are going to separate. The integrator, the customer team is going to try to integrate the ideas that you had talked about, and eventually the backend API or the backend development team is going to try to implement them. And there's going to almost necessarily be a discrepancy due to the fact that you were just talking ideally about what's going to happen. Once you get into the actual day-to-day, you start to realize that idea I need to adjust. So I need you to, make that change. You would hope that you would communicate with the other team. What ends up happening usually is that there is no communication. There's likely a miscommunication between the back-end team and the front-end team, even in the same team, and you start to realize that the API that you designed and the API that you deliver completely drifted apart, and it's not what you intended from the get-go. This big feedback loop, essentially, is what causes a lot of the problems. So what we ended up doing at Zapier with a lot of the teams that I work with is we try to bring that feedback loop tighter and tighter as possible. So to avoid incidents, what we ended up doing is something like this. Yes, get together, make an initial design, make an initial guess of what the system should be, allow the backend to implement scaffolds or just the rudimentary interfaces for that API. Next, have the API spec, our OpenAPI, be the contract that you're going to guarantee to the front end. Seems pretty obvious as for this group, that should be the case. But in practice, we usually do one thing and do the other thing instead. With this approach though, we put guardrails along that highway, and those guardrails make sure that we are doing the right thing and that we're preserving the compatibility that we guaranteed. So in an ideal state, this would be the case. You develop the backend really quickly. You push out an OpenAPI spec so that other teams develop it on top of it, preferably using artifacts that you make automatically for them. And ideally, they just keep going in this quicker feedback cycle. And I'll go over how that works. So I'll be switching a bit to the demo and essentially demonstrating each of these cases, but at a high level, we're using code generation to power our OpenAPI. We include that OpenAPI as part of our repo. The API is no longer a documentation. Now it's part of a source code product. And because it's a source code product, we have to be in the loop. So it's very unlikely that a developer would miss something because they're seeing the changes in line to the change request. And then, like I said, we have guardrails, which I'll show, that will prevent you from deploying this out to production because it'll warn you about those problems that you may not have foreseen. And, artifacts and other things that come out of it, of course, with OpenAPI. And repeat this cycle as often as possible. So I've written a very simple app. It's available online. At the end, you'll see a link to it. I would love for you all to play with it and contribute to it. It's definitely not production ready. It's also not FastAPI, most compliant, but it just gets the point across, which is have a little simple script called OpenAPI update that will do what I'm suggesting. Have that be part of your developer experience. You can have other make run server, make OpenAPI to make the experience nice. But just generally speaking, have something that will generate that OpenAPI and include it as a schema YAML. Notice that we're not architecting that design. We're not manually creating the schema. We're relying strictly on the backend doing all that work for us. If a human does a change to the schema, we're going to disallow it, actually. I'll show that in a bit. So here's the repo, just kind of walking you through it really quickly. Here's our primary app, the Books app, and there's that binary over there in a second. So here's, again, a very simple FastAPI implementation. If you're not familiar with FastAPI, it's like Flask or Sinatra in Ruby. It's very simple representation of an endpoint and like to create an API. I have just a couple of very simple models. Again, this is not the way that I would recommend for you to build an API, but our storage layer is basically in memory, so definitely not production ready. And you just have two endpoints for now. get books, create books, and then another one which is not technically part of the schema, at least it's shown here that's false, that we generated. And that's it. That's the whole API. If I wanted to run this thing and see it in action, I just have to make run server, which just runs a Ruby server in the background. And if I were to go to Insomnia to get the schema, you can see the generated schema. Let me make this a little bit bigger. I didn't write a single line of OpenAPI. The OpenAPI got generated by FastAPI by reviewing the code itself. It introspected based off what you've written. You can see that the response model here is book for that create the books. So I'll create books. All right, here it is. And the response is going to be a schema of book. So if you were to go look for the schema of book, you actually see that it's well fleshed out the way you would expect. It has the max length of 100. And if you go to the model, max length of 100 as well. It has the title and everything. It's what you would expect. Could things be better? Of course. There is this other schema, body, create, book, must have been something that I've written incorrectly. But as a human, that you now are seeing the schema, and by the way, that schema is now available in your in your actual source code, you will actually see every single thing that you're doing in there. Right now, it shows no changes because I just went to the endpoint. Just going to make another tab here. I'm going to leave that run server running. And to prove, I'm going to do an OpenAPI update. You'll notice that this little command, it does an OpenAPI schema updated. It actually bumped the version from 7.17 to 9.20. This is something that we're trying. I'm not saying this is the best thing, but we're trying what's called calendar versioning. We want our schema and our artifacts to be versioned as you're making changes. It has been easier for us to discern, hey, wait a minute, this has changed recently, what's going on? So you can actually see how that is implemented really simply here, where we're just literally reading the project TOML. If you're not familiar, it's like a poetry file, the concept that will, define the version for that project. And we're just feeding it through. We don't need to do anything elaborate there. So let's say I make a very simple change. Maybe I decide to make another endpoint. I'm going to cheat a little bit, grab a little snippet here, and I'm just going to add it here. So save that, and I need to import this guy from FastAPI exceptions, import HTTP exception. All right, so just really quickly, what I've added is a delete endpoint for book ID and 204. The application automatically reloaded. I could run this manually and look at the schema output of this, and you can see I already have a diff, a change, and it says, here's what you're adding to it. So it's an operation, delete, and you can see that it's going to return a 204. Now, what I want to point out here is, as a developer, this is great. I can immediately see the feedback. I can immediately see what the changes that I'm doing. And I'm not writing a single line of OpenAPI. I'm letting the machine do that for me. And it's kind of cumbersome to do the updates all the time. So we just have this convenient, target in our makefile called OpenAPI. And it's just going to quickly do this over and over again. Maybe I decide to say, for example, add a pages here. And this is going to complain because the book that I have here doesn't have a page. So I can technically just add this right now. And the run server is going to be happy about it. If I look at the schema, I can see that I've added now pages integer in the book model. So you might be thinking, hey, wait a minute, you're like automatically creating this OpenAPI, you're automatically updating it. Aren't you going to run into situations where you're going to do backwards compatibility changes? This is one of those cases, actually. We just now made pages required. I'll come back to this in a bit. I just wanted to show that the developer experience for our backend engineers that work in the team that I'm in, we're just constantly doing this really quickly. We want to see the development changes that we're doing come live as quickly as possible. Now, so coming back to the presentation, that's OpenAPI update and relying on FastAPI. There's also Django Spectacular. There's other projects out there as well that essentially you want your code to represent the OpenAPI schema. Now, we can also, just as a quick sidebar, we have in our case, because we're breaking out of the monolith, where we want these new services to take over the monolith functionality. And one of the things that we've noticed is it's very easy and cumbersome, I should say, to take models of the new system, hand write them in the monolith, in the old one, and try to keep up to date with those changes coming upstream in our new service. So what we've done is we just made a little convenience here, OpenAPI packages update and publish, that essentially does what the name says. So here I'm gonna open yet one more, and I can leave the other ones running continuously. OpenAPI packages update. You recall I've added a new endpoint, and I've also set pages on the model. So this is going to go, it's kind of like Yarn workspaces, but we try to, at Zapier, to minimize the dependencies that we have in our systems, keeping them nice and lean. So it's just a really simple federated like NPM run. That's all it does. And so it actually goes through each of these projects in the packages. I could extensively just add another folder with a package JSON in there. And this package JSON, it should just implement publish and update. That's it. And the underlying details of what that is up to you all. But I'm just showing here for Pydantic, for example, this thing is going to run data model CodeGen, a popular CodeGen library for OpenAPI, and it spit out this Pydantic file. And you can see it actually looks very similar to that file that we originally had when we have the title with the max length, we have pages now with the integer in it, and those are the models that we like to use in the monolith. We don't need to rewrite them every single time or check with the backend, hey, did you update this, forget about this? No, we don't need to do any of that. We're just relying on the OpenAPI schema, publishing these artifacts, and from these artifacts, we can use them continuously. And I have a TypeScript example as well, where all of these are updated. You'll notice that actually they're not being included in the Git repo. This is, again, one of those experiments that we're playing with, which is, what if you just don't care about the output of this thing? Like you want to generate it off of the OpenAPI, and you don't need to see the actual diff from the source code. You just need to see the diff of the OpenAPI. So your mileage may vary, and you may come to different experiences with that implementation. But yes, like you can actually see that book here now has the pages in there and so on. All right, so the last thing, which is I was alluding to earlier, was the guardrails. All of this is really great. It reduces the toil for us developers to have to do this thing manually. My computer is basically doing all the work for me. I'm just focusing in the backend code. So what's stopping me from doing something incorrectly? So we have, again, in that same OpenAPI little script there, test functionality. It'll check for a couple of things. So checksum and version are very similar to each other. Imagine that as a developer, somebody comes along and says, I'm going to change your schema for you because docs or what have you. So we don't want that. We don't want humans in the loop inside of the schema itself. We don't want customizations there. That's an output of our introspection of the code. So that test checksum is going to verify, hey, did you intend to change this or not? And then version similarly is going to make sure that you're increasing the version every single time. I would say that the version might be an artifact of the way that we would like to work, but checksum for sure, what it does, it tries to make sure that the previous changes that you did are exactly what you have today. So when I generate the schema again, I need to make sure that they're literally the same object. I don't want you to change the contents of it without my knowledge. And then finally, the other one is compatibility. Compatibility is a bit of experimental. I did actually speak with Gene this morning from Aikido, where I was asking, have you cracked the OpenAPI diff? Because that's something that we would be really excited about. I think we have a library that we're using that's pretty good at it, and I'll show a demo of that next. But anyway, we're using these 3 checks, and we're using them in our GitLab pipeline. And we're preventing any code going to production if you manually updated the OpenAPI schema, if you manually changed the version or forgot to change the version. And we're also checking the compatibility to make sure that you're not breaking changes in between changes. So what does that look like in practice? So I've introduced, for sure, a breaking change called pages int. So if I were to do OpenAPI test compatibility, let's check to make sure that this thing is actually finding it. So yes, it found it. It sees that you've added here a pages thing, and that's a required change. That would break compatibility. For the sake of conferring this, I'm going to save this. Keep in mind, this is in the background, automatically updating, right? So I don't need to, if I wanted to, I can look at the schema, and I would notice that pages is now gone from the book itself. Yeah. So anyway, it's gone. So if I were to run the compatibility again, I'm expecting it that, of course, it would pass. Now, you notice that it didn't complain about delete book. I added that recently. Why is it not complaining? Well, it's an additive change. The delete book wasn't there before. You can always add new endpoints. You just can't mess with the ones that existed before. And again, if you're wondering, how is it that it knows the before and after? Well, we have the previous schema, right? Part of this linchpin of all this is we put the schema as part of your code. It's now part of the repo. So we actually pull from the main branch of your Git repo, we pulled the last one that was there. We then compare it against each other, against the new one that got generated. And it's simple as that as a compatibility score. We're keeping ourselves honest by comparing it. So at a high level, that's the presentation. I've been encouraged by the results that we're seeing within Zapier. This has been basically the way that we've been experimenting as we go along. We've been building new systems using this approach first, OpenAPI approach first. We're putting everything on the OpenAPI. We're putting the OpenAPI as part of your code, and we're disallowing any changes to our APIs unless that we review what that OpenAPI looks like and what it's supposed to mean on the output side. We're also taking that OpenAPI, we're verifying compatibility, making sure that it is doing what it's supposed to be doing. And finally, we generate models and tools that avoid extraneous work by developers any further. And we do all this by automation. And yeah. Thanks again for inviting me for this. If you have any questions, I would love to answer your questions. You can find the repo with the app and the example, the scripts and everything in there. But yeah. Yes?
Are you saying the order of development or the sequence of development is that you build the service first and only then build the consumers, or does this also allow for parallel development of consumer and the provider?
Right. Your question is, I showed this little graph right here, or like this timeline. Right. So it kind of depicts it at that the consumer would wait for the backend to be done. Technically, yes. But what I'm also saying is you don't need to be fully done, right? What I'm saying is get the interfaces done, right? Like you can agree on the interface that you're going to have with your consumer, have that be done, and just leave it as not implemented, or maybe just provide a mock data response, what have you, but don't actually do the thing. And that's a low, that's a quick way to just get things going for them, especially if you can deliver the models, the artifacts, the testing environment that they can just quickly try. I didn't show this, but like with the API that you have here, you have Swagger docs or redocs, like they can start already playing with what you intend to do in there. And like I showed in the code, and actually I didn't show that, I suppose, as demonstration, but I have basically Insomnia here. If I wanted to get the books, this looks like a real service. If I create another book here and just run it, it does what it's supposed to be doing. If I wanted to, by the way, I did add that delete. And here I can say 0, get rid of this guy, and delete, run this. 204, did I actually delete it? Let's try it. Yes, the first one got deleted. And technically I could try to delete something that doesn't exist, and I think I'm supposed to see a 404, yeah. So again, I think our mission is tighten the feedback cycle as much as possible. And number 2, unburden the developers. Let them run fast with what they need to do. Part of the theory here is we sometimes end up designing and thinking too much about a system without realizing that the ground truth is different from what you had realized. And for us, right here, I'm showing a V1 for all these endpoints. My Mecca, my ideal state would be have the tooling in place that you can just iterate through the Vs. Like, we don't care if it's V1, 2, 3, 4, 100. If anything, that would unburden us in a different kind of way. Like right now, we're so worried about keeping the V1 happy when we're adding things or like modifying some things. But honestly, and I didn't say that, but like here, the solution for this would be to make that optional. Yeah, to backward and backwards compatible is make it optional. And then at that point, save this, check the compatibility now. It shouldn't complain. Yeah, it didn't complain because it's optional. And then even here in the actual code itself, like when you enter, you can imagine in the database layer, hey, we wanted to add a column, we didn't make it nullable, we just blew up the whole thing. So we're experimenting with this idea of like really tightening I need to preface it. We don't necessarily intend to couple the interface with the underlying data model, but we do intend to couple the interface with the consumer. We're making that contract. I didn't show it here. It could be its own presentation, but we have kind of like a domain-driven development approach to breaking up our interfaces with our storage. So again, this is not the example of like how to avoid that coupling, but at a high level, you want to, demonstrate what you intend immediately or as soon as possible. Yep. Any other questions? I think I saw one over here, but yep.
Yeah, you said before that you're generating docs or documentation.
Yep.
Do you mean that you're just generating like a list of an endpoint descriptions?
It could be. So I think that example would be, so here, there's no description to this. If I were to go to the schema and look for the create endpoint, there's no description here. So here I could write a create book, and technically this is, whatever you want. Save this one, and then you go back to here, and then there it is, implemented automatically in there. Now, that's just one example of it. FastAPI, the default name for the API is going to be FastAPI. So in here, the way that you would, document clearly, it would be book API, and you just keep, right? Like, I'm kind of showing you a state where it's not done, but as a, the other presentation about API stewardship, yes, that's not included in this presentation. But the aspiration is that the schema YAML, the OpenAPI, that is your way to generate the docs as well. You try to embed as much as you can from the app itself. Yep.
Okay, so so what you're saying is that you can put a lot of, so this is in scheme, you put a lot of, you can add all sorts of things into the fields, and then when you generate the doc, it already pre-populates that stuff.
Exactly. Yeah, you can deprecate individual fields as well. You would just use it's actually better shown here in in this example with books Pydantic. This field actually has a lot more elaborate information in there. So, you're basically just seeing the surface of what FastAPI and the annotations that you can add to your code. And when FastAPI introspects your own code, the own definition of it, it will create a plethora of information. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that if I go to no, not the one. Is it docs? I forget. Yeah, there's a way to see the API docs off the bat, but right now I don't know it. But yeah, there's actually even a HTML version of your docs immediately right now. So you don't have to compile that out or whatnot. But of course, going back to packages, all you have to do for the current setup that we have is create another package JSON here, and you just have to put a update and publish, and essentially have the update do the code generation that you would find online to read a schema YAML. All of these, by the way, are just using environment variables for where the OpenAPI schema is. I'm kind of happy about the setup here because it supports any number of languages now. This is Python, the other one is TypeScript, and it could be any innumerate number of things that you want to output. And again, it's all part of your repository. We were at one point, we originally had a design repo where we were designing our OpenAPI, our services. We would have docs and everything there. But we would notice that we had to orchestrate the two repositories. We would design it, and it would take an innumerable amount of time to go to the backend to make those changes. So we would have teams say, oh, but this thing says this, and your API doesn't say this. And then our docs, even though we published them and made them manually, would say something else, but then the backend. So yeah, we're trying to get rid of all that and just say, if you see it online, then that's the truth. Yeah. Any other questions? All right, well, I'll be around if you all have any other questions. Thanks so much.